In October of 2013, 25-year-old geology student Maya Jimenez went missing in the Gray Butte Trail area on Mount Shasta. They searched for her for weeks, combing every ravine and every ledge, but no trace of her was found. On June 12th, a Wednesday, Maya had set out for what should have been a routine hike. She wasn't a novice taking reckless risks, she was a seasoned hiker, a young woman whose studies and passion were deeply intertwined with the volcanic landscapes of the Cascade Range. Her friends later told investigators that she had been exploring trails since her teenage years. The mountain was both her laboratory and her cathedral. The Gray Butte Trail, a popular route on Shasta's western flank, known for its breathtaking views, was familiar territory for her. She knew its switchbacks, its scree fields, and its ancient, gnarled junipers. She hiked it several times a year for research purposes. This wasn't a treacherous backcountry expedition. It was routine, well-trodden terrain. And that's the first thing that doesn't add up. The simplicity of the path where she disappeared. Her day began like any other. Around 10:15 in the morning, a security camera at the old ski bowl parking lot recorded Maya's modest hatchback pulling in. That timestamp became a concrete anchor in a story that would soon dissolve into uncertainty. She parked near the lot's edge, overlooking the vast expanse of the Sacramento Valley. Investigators later reconstructed these moments meticulously, searching for any clue, any anomaly. She stepped out, grabbed a bottle of water, a light windbreaker, and her small, sturdy backpack, holding her rock hammer and field journal. Everything was normal, routine. The trail register at the start of the path bore her signature at approximately 10:40 a.m., Maya Jimenez. The confident, looping script of a young woman with a full day and a full life ahead of her. She was setting out for a few hours of research and solitude in a place she loved. She wasn't alone on the trail that morning. It's important to note that around 11:30 a.m., about a mile in, a group of 3 hikers descending the path saw her. They would later become key witnesses, the last confirmed people to see her. They told authorities she looked cheerful, focused, moving with a steady, determined gait. She smiled, offered a friendly, beautiful day, and continued up the trail, a solitary figure in the vast landscape of rock and sky. And then she vanished. The hours that followed are a complete blank. Maya was a responsible person. She had plans. She was supposed to be back in Redding by evening to meet her roommate for dinner. Her roommate, Sarah Chun, said they had arranged to meet around 7:30 p.m., but that time came and went. Sarah waited, initially assuming Maya had stayed longer on the mountain. She sent a few texts. No reply. By 9 p.m., worry had turned into fear, and she called the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher logged the call and alerted the U.S. Forest Service rangers responsible for Mount Shasta. The first sheriff's deputy reached Gray Butte Trailhead after midnight. The parking lot was dark and empty, except for one lone vehicle, Maya's hatchback, still parked exactly where she had left it. Inside the car, everything appeared ordinary, eerily so. Her purse was tucked under the passenger seat. Her keys were in the ignition. A geology textbook and a half-eaten sandwich rested on the passenger seat. But there was something unusual. Her cell phone, turned off, sat in the cup holder. Why would an experienced hiker, a geology student no less, leave her primary means of communication behind? Friends said she sometimes left her phone in the car to disconnect, to immerse herself completely in nature. But even so, they admitted it was unusual. In a case with no evidence, small details mattered. There were no signs of a struggle. The car was locked, windows rolled up, nothing disturbed. It was as if she had simply stepped out and been swallowed whole by the mountain itself. Around 2 a.m., the initial search began. The deputies and rangers started at the trailhead and worked their way up the first section of the trail, their powerful flashlights cutting cones of white light through the pitch-black, silent forest. They used a thermal imager, a device designed to detect body heat. But the night was cool, the kind of high-altitude chill that leaches warmth from everything it touches. A motionless human body, they knew, would give off almost no heat signature under such conditions. The search continued until dawn. They found nothing. Not a footprint out of place, not a broken branch, not a single thread from her clothing. As the first pink light of dawn on June 13th touched the snow-capped peak of Shasta, the operation escalated. This was no longer a precautionary check. It was a full-scale search and rescue mission. Specialists from the California Office of Emergency Services arrived, their faces grim and determined. K-9 units from across the state were deployed, their handlers hoping the animals could succeed where human eyes had failed. Volunteers, hundreds of them, fanned out across the rugged volcanic terrain. In the areas where the trail skirted steep canyons and vast fields of jagged lava rock, specialized mountaineering teams rappelled down, checking every crevice, every overhang. They tied bright orange ribbons to trees, creating a methodical grid over a landscape that seemed to mock their efforts. Above, the sky buzzed with the sound of a California Highway Patrol helicopter, its advanced thermal cameras scanning the vast, forested slopes below. The mountain was being watched from every possible angle. The search dogs, usually the most reliable tool in these situations, gave the first truly unsettling clue. They picked up a trail, a strong one, leading from the parking lot onto the main path. This was expected. But then, about 1.5 miles from the start of the route, near a distinctive outcropping of red volcanic rock, the trail broke off, abruptly, completely. One of the K-9 handlers tried to rationalize it. He suggested that the notoriously unpredictable winds on Shasta might have scattered the scent, or that the rocky, porous ground didn't hold scent well. But other, more experienced searchers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that dogs can usually, at the very least, indicate a general direction of travel, even with a degraded trail. In this case, it was different. The trail didn't just fade away. It stopped cold. It was as if Maya Jimenez had been walking along the path and was suddenly lifted into the sky. What remains unclear is how that could possibly happen. The search intensified over the following days. The teams combed not only the official trail, but every inch of the surrounding wilderness. They explored dry creek beds, navigated treacherous lava fields, and followed the faint game trails known only to local hunters. Some of the searchers noted how difficult the terrain was for tracking. The volcanic soil was loose and shifting, and the rocky surfaces were scoured clean by wind and rain, leaving no lasting impressions. But the more they looked, the more one terrifying fact became undeniable. There was no trace of Maya Jimenez. Nothing. On the 7th day, the operation moved to the higher, more remote areas far from the main trail places where a casual hiker would have no reason to go. They checked narrow lava tubes, peered into shadowy box canyons where, according to the seasoned rangers, they had sometimes found lost people in the past, huddled and waiting for rescue. But this time, every search team came back empty-handed. Their faces, once hopeful, were now etched with a deep, weary frustration and disbelief. Maya's family arrived at Mount Shasta the day after she was reported missing. They were plunged into a waking nightmare that has no blueprint. They joined the volunteers, their hearts aching with every step they took into the silent forest. They handed out flyers with Maya's smiling face on them, talking to every hiker they encountered, their voices trembling as they asked the same question over and over: "Did you see anything? Anything at all?" A few people recalled seeing a lone man with a large, old-fashioned pack on a different trail that day, but their descriptions were vague and inconsistent. No one remembered seeing anyone matching Maya's description after that final encounter with the descending hikers. No one saw anything suspicious. No one heard a cry for help. After 3 long, agonizing weeks, the official search was scaled back. Resources were finite, and there were no new leads to follow. Officially, the case remained active, but the large-scale presence on the mountain was gone. The Siskiyou County Sheriff, speaking to the press, tried to put it into context. He explained that in most cases, they find something. A piece of clothing snagged on a manzanita bush, a dropped water bottle, a scuff mark from a fall, something that points in a direction that tells a small part of the story. In Maya's case, he said, there was nothing. Not a single thread, not a single misplaced stone, not a single clue to suggest she had made a navigational error. It was a perfect, terrifying void. By the end of July, with the summer heat at its peak, Maya's case was formally transferred to a regional missing persons task force. It became a file, a number, another name on a long, sad list. But even among the jaded professionals who deal with these cases every day, Maya's story stood out. Several rescuers, speaking to reporters off the record, admitted that this one was different. It was unsettling. Usually, they said, the tracks lead somewhere into a canyon, toward an old, abandoned mine shaft, into an area of a recent rock slide. Here, there was no trail to follow. There was no direction. There was no explanation. Maya Jimenez had disappeared in the middle of the day on a trail she knew well, in perfect weather, on a route frequented by other people. The fact that hundreds of trained searchers, volunteers, and dogs, equipped with the best technology available, found not a single clue in the days and weeks that followed, added a profound layer of high strangeness to the case, even for a place like Mount Shasta. It was as if someone, or something, had simply plucked her from the world, leaving behind nothing but a chilling, silent question mark that hung heavy in the mountain air. The weeks that followed Maya Jimenez's disappearance settled into a grueling rhythm for her family and for the investigators assigned to her case. It was a period of monotonous tension, where every phone call could be a breakthrough, and every lead pursued ended in another quiet dead end. The active search on the mountain had lasted for about a month, and in that time, law enforcement and volunteers had exhausted every conventional strategy. They had covered miles of unforgiving terrain, and the mountain had offered up nothing. Now, the search had to move elsewhere. The regional task force, working alongside the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office, began the methodical, grim work of checking hospitals. They compiled a list of every medical facility in Northern California and Southern Oregon Redding, Medford, Klamath Falls. They checked every hospital that had received an unidentified female patient, a Jane Doe, between June 12th and the end of the month. According to the doctors and nurses on duty, investigators physically visited the emergency rooms, showing Maya's photograph, asking if anyone remembered a woman matching her description being brought in. The answer, over and over again, was no. Nothing was recorded. No one recognized her face. Simultaneously, another team of detectives focused on the transient populations and off-grid communities that dot the landscape around Mount Shasta. They checked motels and campgrounds along the I-5 corridor and in the small, eclectic towns that surround the mountain. They spoke to managers, showed them the same photograph, and left flyers with Maya's information. The response was always the same: a shake of the head, a sympathetic look, but no recognition. The police went so far as to obtain warrants for guest registers from several hotels, meticulously checking every name, every license plate number. Not a single entry offered even a remote connection to Maya. They turned their attention to her digital life, hoping to find a breadcrumb in the modern trail of data we all leave behind. Law enforcement obtained warrants to access her financial records, her bank accounts, her credit card statements. The result was just another wall of silence. All of her cards had been inactive since the morning of her disappearance. There had been no withdrawals, no purchases, no attempts to use them anywhere in California or in any other state. It was at this point, according to one investigator who spoke to a local newspaper on the condition of anonymity, that a chilling thought began to take hold. It was as if Maya hadn't just gone missing. She had been erased from the map entirely. A week after the search began, Maya's family, desperate for answers and feeling the official investigation was hitting a wall, made a decision. They hired a private investigator. His name was Leo Corbin, a retired LAPD detective who now specialized in missing persons cases in the wilderness. Corbin brought a fresh set of eyes and a relentless, methodical approach to the case. He worked in parallel with the official investigation, but with a freedom that law enforcement didn't always have. According to Maya's family, he was in the Mount Shasta area almost every day. He re-interviewed hikers who had been on the trail between June 11th and 13th. He ventured off the main trails, exploring the places the initial search might have overlooked. He spent hours talking to local prospectors and longtime residents in the more remote areas, people who knew the land in a way that official maps never could. Corbin even took it upon himself to check a number of abandoned mines and unmapped lava tubes left over from the region's past. It was a dangerous, painstaking process. Although the official rescue teams had considered this hypothesis unlikely, Corbin wanted to leave no stone unturned. But the result was the same everywhere he looked. Nothing. Despite the crushing lack of evidence, Maya's family refused to give up hope. In that first year, they organized several more mass searches on the mountain, events that drew not only their friends, but also complete strangers, people from the community who were touched by their story. But with each passing day, the search area they had to cover grew wider, and the logic behind where to look grew thinner. There was no place it made sense for her to have gone voluntarily. There were no tracks to suggest an accident had befallen her in a specific location. They were searching a vast wilderness for a ghost. At the end of that summer, the official call was made. The U.S. Forest Service, in conjunction with the sheriff's office, notified the family that the active phase of the search was being suspended, citing the complete exhaustion of all available leads and options. The official wording was standard, bureaucratic, and cold. No new information has been developed. Further search operations are pending the discovery of new evidence. In unofficial conversations, however, several rescue workers were more candid. They admitted that the case of Maya Jimenez had become one of the most baffling and mysterious disappearances in years. Because even on a mountain as vast and strange as Shasta, a place known for disappearances, there is almost always a trace. A small clue that indicates where a person went last. A few months later, without any public announcement, the case was quietly moved to the cold case files. This meant that while it remained officially open, no active resources would be dedicated to it. No new search operations were planned. A report dated at the end of December 2019, which a journalist for a Sacramento news station later obtained through a public records request, laid out the grim reality. The report stated that the case lacked any factual reference points for further investigation, and that the probability of finding Maya alive was now estimated as extremely low. The family learned about this final devastating assessment not from the police, but from reading it online. Despite the official verdict, Maya's parents refused to let her memory fade. They did not declare the search over. For them, it would never be over. Every year, on June 12th, the anniversary of her disappearance, they would gather a small group of friends and loyal volunteers. They would drive up to the Gray Butte trailhead, sign the register, and hike the familiar route, their eyes scanning the same landscape that had been searched so many times before. They checked the side trails, their voices calling her name into the silent forest. It was a symbolic act, a ritual of remembrance and defiance. But it gave the family a sense of action in the face of an overwhelming and passive void. In the case file, there is a recording of Maya's mother, made by a reporter during one of these anniversary hikes. Her voice is heavy with a grief that has not lessened with time. "We don't know what happened to her," she says, "but we can't get used to the fact that she just disappeared. People don't just disappear." Meanwhile, in the cold case unit, Maya's file was gradually pushed to the back of the cabinet. In the year following her disappearance, 2 other hikers went missing in the Sierra Nevada. Both cases were less mysterious. In both cases, the bodies were eventually recovered. Against the backdrop of these more conventional tragedies, the Jimenez case looked even more inexplicable. No traces, no witnesses, no logic. There is one more detail noted in the police files, a final avenue of investigation that was explored and closed. In the first months, detectives seriously considered the possibility of a voluntary disappearance, perhaps to join one of the many fringe spiritual groups in the Shasta area. They constructed a psychological profile, dug into her life, looking for a reason she might have wanted to run away. But everything they found pointed in the opposite direction. Her financial records showed no unusual activity, no large withdrawals, no signs of her saving up for a new life. Her social contacts, her correspondence with friends and family, her online activity, it all painted a picture of a happy, stable young woman. The psychologist who worked with the family concluded there were no indicators of depression, no signs she was preparing to escape her life. Maya had no reason to run away. She had simply vanished in the middle of the day, on a path where other people were walking at the very same time. Months turned into a year, and the case grew silent. All the family had left was their perseverance and a fragile hope, a hope they clung to even as the uncertainty around them deepened. Mount Shasta continued to live its own ancient life, as if nothing had happened, as if another one of its secrets had simply reclaimed another person. The family waited. The police waited. But there was no answer from anywhere. Almost 2 years passed. 2 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a family trapped in a state of suspended grief. The world moved on. Maya Jimenez's name faded from the headlines, becoming a piece of local lore, another ghost story to be told around a campfire on the slopes of the mysterious mountain. And then, on May 20th, 2021, everything changed. The location was a remote northern section of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, miles from any official trail. The late spring snow was still melting in the higher elevations, and the forest floor was a riot of new growth. The extensive lava tube systems that honeycombed the earth beneath the volcanic slopes now attracted only the most dedicated and experienced spelunkers and urban explorers. On this particular day, 3 members of a Northern California caving group decided to venture into a sector that was officially closed to visitors due to instability. They didn't register their route with the Forest Service. They didn't file a research plan. By their own admission, they saw it as a harmless adventure, a chance to explore a place few had ever seen. They were breaking the rules. And in doing so, they were about to stumble into the heart of a mystery that everyone else had long given up on. Police records show the group consisted of 2 men and a woman, all in their 30s, all experienced cavers. They had the proper equipment, helmets with powerful LED headlamps, ropes, carabiners, and light packs with water and emergency supplies. The lava tube they chose was marked on unofficial maps as an unstable branch system, one without stabilized passages or cleared routes. It was known among local cavers for its tight squeezes, sudden vertical drops, and labyrinthine passages. It was not a place for amateurs. For the first hour, the descent was uneventful. The passages were narrow, as expected, but the volcanic rock was stable. They navigated standard ledges and scree slopes, their movements practiced and confident. They paused several times to check their handheld air quality monitors. Some of these undeveloped lava tubes were known to have pockets of bad air, where carbon dioxide could build up to dangerous levels. The devices showed nothing suspicious. According to the testimony of one of the cavers, who would later speak to investigators, everything changed when they entered what's known as a breakdown room, a large chamber filled with a chaotic jumble of fallen rock. After several minutes of carefully navigating this treacherous terrain, they saw a sloping shaft running down along the wall, leading to a small vertical drop. As the lead caver lit up the area below, preparing to lower a rope, his headlamp caught a glint of something at the bottom. A small man-made object. At first, he told investigators, he thought it was just a piece of trash, maybe a lost tool from a previous explorer. But when he reached the bottom of the drop, he saw what it was. It was a small, intricately carved obsidian arrowhead of a style he'd never seen before. It was immediately clear that it hadn't been there for very long. It wasn't covered in dust or calcite deposits. The carving was still crisp. The discovery was strange. In caves of this type, sealed off from the elements, you might find ancient artifacts, but finding something so pristine and unusual was rare. It was this discovery that made them decide to press on rather than turn back. They chose to check two side passages that branched off from the main chamber. The one on the left seemed to have a slight draft of air coming from it. This new passage was difficult. They had to squeeze through sideways, their bodies scraping against the sharp, abrasive volcanic rock. After a few minutes of this slow, arduous progress, the tunnel suddenly widened. They had entered a small grotto with a dry, dusty stone floor. The air was still and heavy. The lead caver was the first one to step inside. He raised his headlamp, the powerful beam of light cutting through the absolute, profound darkness, sliding across the ancient stone walls. And that's when he saw it. In the far corner of the grotto, there was a motionless figure. At first, he said, his brain tried to rationalize it. He thought it was just a large, oddly shaped rock formation. The contours were irregular, and the harsh light from his headlamp cast strange, deceptive shadows. But as he took a step closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. He was looking at a person, or what was left of one. The beam of his flashlight finally found the face. The cavers, according to their later testimony, were utterly convinced they had found a corpse. The figure was sitting on the floor, its back propped against the uneven wall of the grotto. Its knees were bent, and its hands rested limply on the stone beside it. The body was skeletal, emaciated to a degree that seemed impossible. The skin was a pale, grayish color, stretched taut over the bones, almost translucent. Long, matted hair hung in lifeless strands. The scene was one of utter desolation. It looked like a mummified body, something that had been sitting in the dry, still air of the cave for years, perhaps even centuries. None of the cavers dared to approach it right away. They were frozen in a state of shock and disbelief. In the official police reports, there is a quote from one of them that was relayed to the investigators. "It looked," she said, "like she had been sitting there for 100 years. But the lead caver didn't look away. And in that moment of stunned silence, he noticed a detail that changed everything. A detail that defied all logic. The figure's chest rose. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Once, and then again. She was breathing. The group rushed forward, their fear momentarily replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Their combined headlamps illuminated the face. The eyes were half open, the pupils vacant and almost completely unresponsive to the bright light. The cheeks were hollowed out, etched with the geography of profound and prolonged starvation. All three cavers stated unanimously and with absolute certainty that the woman was breathing. It was a shallow, barely noticeable breath, but it was undeniably there. She was alive. Later, in the official case file, investigators would commend the three cavers for their actions. They acted with remarkable clarity and professionalism in a situation that would have caused most people to panic. They did not touch the woman. They did not try to move her. Recognizing the potential for bad air in the deeper galleries, and knowing she needed immediate expert medical help, they immediately began to retreat toward the cave entrance to call for rescuers. The signal from their phones was, of course, non-existent deep inside the earth. They had to climb back to the surface, moving as quickly as they could through the narrow, treacherous passages. Only when they were back in the open air of the forest were they able to dial 911. The dispatcher's recording from that day captures the raw, trembling urgency of the moment. The log reads, "A man was yelling that they had found a person underground. He said she was barely moving. His voice was trembling." The information was immediately relayed to the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office, who in turn alerted a specialized mountain rescue unit. According to the senior rescuer who took the call, they were deeply skeptical. They did not expect to find anyone alive at that depth, especially not a person who had somehow survived for an extended period in an environment so hostile to human life. But they prepared for the mission. As the rescue team began to assemble at the mouth of the lava tube just before sunset, the full complexity of the situation became apparent. The initial assessment, based on the cavers' description of the route, was daunting. In their testimony, the cavers mentioned one other detail that investigators would later single out as critically important. There were no foreign traces in the grotto where the woman was found. No backpack, no water bottle, no equipment. No signs that she had wandered in on her own and become lost. She was simply sitting in a dead-end chamber of a cave with no other visible exit. While the specialized equipment and medical teams were being prepared on the surface, the three cavers who found her remained in a state of profound shock. One of them later told a reporter that he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen a living person, but a ghost that, for some inexplicable reason, was still breathing. At that time, none of them knew that the woman they had found in the deep, silent darkness of the grotto was Maya Jimenez, who had been missing for almost 2 years. And absolutely no one could begin to comprehend how she could have possibly survived in that underground prison for so long. The specialized mountain rescue team arrived at the remote location within an hour of the call. According to the team leader, a man with decades of experience in the labyrinthine cave systems of Northern California, they realized almost immediately that a standard evacuation procedure would be impossible. The passage leading to the grotto where Maya was found was too narrow. The grotto itself was a dead end, and the descent involved several vertical drops and unstable crawlways that made carrying a person on a stretcher in the usual way impossible. The team had to essentially build a route as they went, widening some of the passages with specialized tools and installing improvised supports in places where the ancient volcanic rock crumbled at the slightest touch. It was a slow, dangerous, and incredibly delicate operation. The first paramedic reached the grotto about 45 minutes after the team began their descent. His official report, written later, paints a stark picture of what he found. He found Maya in the same sitting position the cavers had described. Her breathing was dangerously slow, and her pulse was so faint it was barely detectable. In his words, she looked like a person who had been deprived of food, light, and movement for a very, very long time. Her core body temperature was critically low, even for the naturally cool conditions of the cave. Her skin, he noted, was covered in numerous bruises, old calluses, and deep lacerations on her shoulders and forearms. The medic made a critical decision on the spot. He would not perform any active manipulations. In her fragile state, any careless movement could cause further injury, or even prove fatal. He simply placed small, inflatable supports under her back to stabilize her position and signaled to the team on the surface to prepare a specialized, rigid stabilization stretcher for the long ascent. What followed was a complicated, nerve-wracking lifting operation that lasted for over 8 hours. The internal report from the rescue service describes the movements as being performed inch by inch. The ropes, essential for the lift, constantly dislodged small fragments of rock, forcing the rescuers to pause and re-secure their anchors every few minutes. The temperature in the narrowest sections of the cave was a damp, penetrating cold that made even the most experienced caver shiver. According to one of the rescuers quoted in the report, there was no panic, but there was a palpable sense of fear. Everyone realized, he said, that a tiny miscalculation could put an end to both her and us. The ascent took the entire night. Halfway up the route, The team had to construct a temporary platform using metal rails they had brought with them after the initial inspection. This allowed them to rest and recalibrate the rigging. Maya was lifted in a semi-reclined position, her head and limbs carefully secured because her body was completely limp and unbalanced. The report makes a chilling note. Throughout the entire arduous, noisy, and physically demanding rescue, she never once made a sound. She never changed her facial expression. When Maya was finally brought to the surface, it was late in the evening. The air was cold and crisp. A temporary medical center had been set up at the mouth of the lava tube, bathed in the harsh, sterile light of portable generators. For the first time, doctors were able to examine her in normal light. They immediately transmitted their initial findings to the dispatcher. The patient was in critical condition. Her life was in immediate danger. She needed to be airlifted to a major trauma center without delay. The helicopter lifted off around midnight. According to the flight nurse who accompanied Maya, the patient remained completely unresponsive. She did not react to his voice, to the bright lights inside the cabin, or to his touch. Her eyes were still half open, her pupils moving weakly beneath her eyelids in a way that suggested minimal brain activity. No meaningful contact could be established. The flight crew's report noted her heart rate was dangerously irregular, hovering on the threshold of cardiac arrest. They also noted a peculiar, pungent smell of underground dust and what appeared to be traces of dried organic matter in her hair and under her fingernails. These substances would later be collected for separate analysis. Doctors at the UC Davis Medical Center in Sacramento received the patient shortly after 1 a.m. The initial examination in the emergency room revealed a shocking litany of medical issues: profound exhaustion, severe, long-term hypothermia, chronic dehydration, and clear signs of advanced vitamin deficiencies, particularly vitamin D, which is typical of people who have had no exposure to sunlight for an extended period. But it was the X-rays that revealed something even more sinister. The images clearly showed several old, improperly healed fractures. Her ribs, her wrist, and her ulna, the bone in her forearm, all showed evidence of having been broken at different times in the past. The medical report stated unequivocally that these injuries were unlikely to have been accidental. They had occurred at different times. The examination of her body revealed more clues. They found characteristic abrasions on her back and hips, the kind of marks that come from repeated pressure, suggesting she had been held in one position on a hard surface for a very long time. The tips of her fingers were cracked and raw, so much so that in some places the epidermis had been completely worn away. Her fingernails were brittle and scratched down to the quick, with evidence of bleeding underneath them, a possible sign, the doctors noted, of desperate attempts to claw her way out of a confined space. Her mental state was a separately, and the findings were perhaps the most disturbing of all. The report from the psychiatrist on duty read, "The patient demonstrates an almost complete lack of response to external stimuli. She is in a state of stupor. Her gaze is unfocused. There is no discernible emotional response." An additional report noted that Maya would try to close her eyes when a bright light was directed at her, but the reaction was weak, delayed, and diffuse. She did not respond to voices. She did not follow simple commands. The psychiatrist theorized she was in a state of deep dissociation, a profound psychological defense mechanism that can occur in individuals who have experienced prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and extreme trauma. The medical team was preparing for the worst. They noted in their consultations that even with intensive resuscitation efforts, the chances of her vital functions being fully restored were minimal. At a conference held the next morning, they discussed the long-term prognosis, should she even survive the next few hours. One of the doctors wrote in an internal memo, a line that perfectly captures the horror of her condition. She looked as if her body was alive, but her consciousness had long since left. At that moment, No one could say for certain what had happened to Maya Jimenez in the 2 years she was gone, but it was terrifyingly obvious that she had been underground for much, much longer than any human being should be able to endure. And something or someone had kept her in that dark, silent place long enough to completely erase the line between life and death, order and chaos in her own mind. Detective Kato Tanaka of the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office arrived at the lava tube site the morning after Maya's dramatic rescue. He was a veteran, a man who had worked in the strange and rugged landscape of Northern California for many years. He'd seen his share of bizarre cases, especially around Mount Shasta. But as he later noted in his official report, no case had ever started like this one, with a person being found alive, feet underground, but almost completely severed from the world of the living. A team of forensic experts descended into the cave in 2 stages. The first was a preliminary survey, mapping the route the rescuers had taken to extract Maya. The second was a detailed, painstaking examination of the grotto where she had been found. The report states that they had to proceed with extreme caution. Any careless movement could kick up dust and damage what little potential evidence remained. When they set up their own portable lighting, the grotto was revealed to be slightly larger than the cavers had first estimated. And the scene it revealed, in their own words, made the seasoned experts feel cold, despite the stable temperature of the cave. On the stone floor, they found an improvised bed. It was a dense, matted layer of moss, lichens, and thin, dried roots. The shape was compressed, with clear indentations showing that someone had been lying on it for a very, very long time. It was neatly formed, not just a chaotic pile. It was as if the person who made it was trying to maintain some semblance of order, a tiny piece of civilization in the oppressive darkness. In the opposite corner of the grotto, they found a strange structure made of small, carefully arranged stones. Experts suggested it was a primitive reservoir, designed to collect the water that slowly dripped from a fissure in the ceiling. The stones were lined with a thin layer of fine sand, and tiny, hand-carved micro-ditches were clearly visible, channeling the precious drops of water into a central pool. This meant that the person who lived here had a sophisticated understanding of how to survive in an environment with extremely limited resources. It was not the work of a panicked, lost hiker. It was the work of a long-term inhabitant. Nearby, they found a small pile of bones. Forensic analysis later determined they were the bones of small rodents, most likely marmots or pikas, which are common in the mountainous regions of California. The bones were not scattered. They were neatly gathered in a single pile, as if it were a habit formed over an unimaginable length of time. Some of the skulls had been carefully broken open. Experts confirmed this was likely done to get to the brain, one of the few sources of fat and nutrients available from such small animals. And then they found the item that finally and definitively proved who this person was and that she had been held in this cave for a very long time. It was her backpack, the small, sturdy pack she had taken with her on that hike 2 years earlier. Her family later identified it by a distinctive worn patch on the shoulder strap and a small, faded university logo. Inside, preserved by the dry cave air, was her field journal, its pages swollen and stiff with moisture, and a simple pen with a worn rubber grip. The experts knew better than to open the journal on sight. The paper was so fragile that a breath of air could have caused it to disintegrate. It was placed in a special climate-controlled container and transported to the crime lab. There, under carefully controlled conditions, forensic specialists were able to separate some of the pages. Most of the writings and geological sketches had been washed away by moisture over time, but a few fragments remained legible. On one page, they found a primitive, hand-drawn map of the cave system. The lines were shaky and curved, drawn by an unsteady hand. On the right side of the diagram, there was a mark next to a specific passage, labeled with a single word, exit. An arrow pointed to it, suggesting it was the way to the surface. and below that mark, there was a short, chilling inscription. "It's blocked." He closed the passage. The handwriting itself told a story. The pressure of the pen was uneven. The letters barely formed. This could indicate extreme physical exhaustion, severe psychological distress, or both. But it was the words that electrified the investigation. The phrase, "he closed the passage," was the first concrete evidence of a second person. It was the key. Detective Tanaka noted in his official report, "Any mention of a third party in a localized space of this dungeon, where there are no signs of recent access, is deeply suspicious. If someone closed the exit, it means they were able to enter and exit at will." A geological inspection of the blocked passage confirmed this theory. According to the geologist on the scene, the rubble blocking the passage marked exit did not look like a natural rockfall. The stones were not settled in a way consistent with gravity. Some of the larger fragments had distinctive scratches on them, marks that looked like they had been made by a tool, perhaps a pry bar. On one of the fragments, they even found traces of a clay-mud mixture that was not naturally present in that sector of the lava tube. This implied that someone had brought the materials in from outside to deliberately seal the passage. Another detail seemed critically important to the detective. In the entire grotto, there was not a single item that did not belong to Maya. There were no plastic wrappers, no modern ropes, no metal tools, no evidence of another person's presence. This meant that the outsider, if he existed, was meticulous. He had cleaned up after himself, leaving no trace of his own identity. The department's internal memo summarized the growing consensus. Everything points to the long-term use of this cave, not as a temporary shelter, but as a place of confinement. The question is whether that confinement was voluntary. Detective Tanaka now had his first working theory, a theory that shifted the case from a tragic accident to a deliberate and horrifying crime. Maya did not get here by accident. She was abducted. Someone knew about this hidden lava tube system. Someone who could navigate it with an expertise she lacked. Someone who controlled her access to the only exit. But the central baffling question remained. How could a woman survive in absolute darkness for nearly 2 years without a consistent supply of food or water? The answers, Tanaka hoped, lay with Maya herself. But it was already clear that her story was not just about a disappearance on Mount Shasta. It was something far more complex, more subtle, and infinitely darker. In the first days and weeks after her rescue, the medical team at UC Davis didn't even attempt to have a conversation with Maya. She remained in a semi-conscious state, lying for long periods with her eyes closed, completely unresponsive to any voice or movement at her bedside. It was only after several weeks of intensive intravenous nutrition and care that she began to show the first flickering signs of returning to the world. Slow, hesitant movements of her hands. Brief moments where she seemed to try to focus her eyes. Sporadic, weak reactions to changes in light. The psychiatrist noted that she seemed to turn on for only a few minutes at a time, like a faulty switch, after which she would retreat back into a profound inner silence. The first words she uttered were described by a nurse as a barely audible whisper, like fragments of a half-remembered dream. Her speech was slurred, distorted by a combination of prolonged vocal cord disuse, dehydration, and deep psychological trauma. Slowly, painstakingly, fragments of her story began to emerge in the quiet, sterile rooms of the hospital. Psychologists sat with her for hours, patiently recording every word, every phrase, even when they didn't understand the context. Certain episodes were repeated over and over, like obsessive, incomplete memories stuck on a loop. It was from these shattered pieces of memory that Detective Tanaka was eventually able to assemble the first, tentative chain of events. Maya confirmed that on the day she disappeared, she had, in fact, wandered off the main trail. Her words were spoken in a flat, emotionless monotone. She said she had seen an interesting volcanic rock formation and had left the path to get a closer look. a simple mistake made by countless hikers. But as she climbed higher, the ground beneath her feet, loose scree and volcanic soil, crumbled. She felt herself fall. She remembered hitting her head, hard. That was the last moment of clarity she had. After that, in her own words, everything went dark. She lost consciousness. When she came to, she was no longer on the sunlit mountain. She was lying in a small, dark cavity underground. There was almost no light, just a faint, ghostly glow coming from a narrow passage that led deeper into the cave system. She tried to move toward it, but she was disoriented and weak. She lost her bearings several times in the disorienting blackness. In the silence, she could hear two things: the slow, rhythmic dripping of water somewhere nearby, and a strange, barely perceptible movement of air. Her first attempts to find a way out, she recalled, seemed to last for hours or maybe days. Time had no meaning. She crawled on her hands and knees, her fingers tracing the cold, rough texture of the stone walls, guided only by the temperature of the rock and the faint sound of the dripping water. But the passages branched and narrowed unexpectedly. Several times, she said, she found herself back in the same place, with no understanding of how she had circled back. It was a labyrinth designed by nature. It was then that the footsteps appeared. Maya spoke about this part of her memory with the most hesitation. According to her psychologists, it was as if she was afraid to give the memory a voice, afraid it might become real again. The footsteps were quiet, steady, and rhythmic. At first, she whispered, I thought I was imagining it. But then she realized they were not echoes. They were getting closer. The man, as she called him, never introduced himself. Her description of him was minimal, a phantom sketched from sound and shadow. She never saw his face in the darkness. She could only feel the shift in the air as he approached. He carried something, she said, that produced a weak, yellow light, like an old lantern, but he was always careful never to point it directly at himself, keeping his own form shrouded in shadow. His first actions were not violent. In fact, they seemed like acts of mercy. He gave her a drink of water from a small cup. The water was cold and had a strange metallic taste. Then he brought her something that looked like roots, wrapped in a piece of old cloth. In her delirious and weakened state, she recalled it as an act of inexplicable care. At that moment, it felt like salvation. Then Maya's memories would fade again. It was only after several more therapy sessions that she could articulate the next part of the story. When she had regained some of her strength, she tried to get out of the cave on her own. She tried to find her way back to the light, but the man blocked her path. He moved a stone, she said once, her voice barely a whisper. When the psychologist gently asked how he did it, she replied with two words that spoke volumes. For a long time, and silently, she recalled that the man called himself the Shepherd. She repeated this word several times, as if it had been burned into her memory, separate from everything else. The Shepherd. That's how she said he referred to himself. She wasn't sure if she had heard him say it clearly, or if she had just come to understand it, but she repeated the word with a strange, unnerving confidence. Maya said that he kept her in the dungeon with a calm but absolute authority. He was never overtly violent with her, but his presence was a constant, oppressive force. He would come and go irregularly. Sometimes days would pass between his visits. He would bring her food more roots, and sometimes small rodents, which she said she refused to touch at first. But after days without food, her survival instinct took over. She spoke about the water he collected for her in the stone gutter he had built. She described how sometimes she could hear him breathing nearby in the darkness, but she could never see his face. Sometimes it seemed to her that he was standing very close, just watching her, but he never touched her. The most terrifying periods, she described, were the days of absolute silence. He would disappear for long stretches of time, and the silence would become more than just an absence of sound. It turned into a thick, viscous emptiness that swallowed her sense of time completely. It was during these periods of profound isolation, according to her psychologists, that the deep, lasting damage to her psyche began to form. When the doctors asked her how long she had been in the cave, Maya could only give one answer: a very long time. Her internal clock wasn't just out of sync. It had completely collapsed. According to Detective Tanaka, this was the most disturbing part of her testimony. A woman who went missing on a clear day on a popular trail had spent an amount of time underground that was not measured in hours or days or even weeks. The psychiatrists later concluded that Maya survived not because of her strength, but in spite of its absence. The creature she had been forced to become in the darkness had gradually replaced the human being she once was. Her will to fight had faded away. Her consciousness had been reduced to the most basic, primal reactions: thirst, hunger, fear. She stopped fighting because, in the absolute darkness, there was no one and nothing to fight for. She described all of her later memories as if she were watching a stranger. But she repeated one thing, over and over, without a flicker of doubt in her vacant eyes: "He wouldn't let me leave." Detective Kato Tanaka began pursuing a new, urgent line of investigation the moment Maya Jimenez was able to utter her first intelligible phrases about the man in the dark. In an internal memo, he wrote that her words were the turning point, the moment the case officially shifted from a presumed accident to a deliberate, long-term crime of abduction. And it was then that a name first emerged from the dusty archives of the past, a name that for many years had been nothing more than a shadow in the old records of forgotten geological companies. The name was Elias Thorne. The process of identifying Maya's shepherd began with a careful analysis of what little she could describe. Her memories were fragmented and dreamlike, but certain images repeated themselves. A man who had a habit of walking almost silently. A person who could navigate a complex lava tube system in total darkness, as if he had lived there his entire life. And actions that suggested considerable physical strength and patience. Carrying heavy stones, systematically blocking passages, and engineering a way to collect water from inaccessible ledges. Tanaka started digging. He turned to the archives of a mining exploration company that had conducted extensive geological surveys in the Mount Shasta area back in the 1990s. There, buried among old survey reports and employee dismissal forms, he found the file of a volcanologist who seemed to match these strange characteristics. Elias Thorne had worked for the company for several years. According to the notes in his file and later interviews with former colleagues, he was a brilliant but deeply eccentric specialist. He knew the structure of the local volcanic formations intimately. He had extensive experience in lava tube systems, and he possessed an almost uncanny ability to navigate in the dark without using even the most basic equipment. However, the archival records also contained numerous references to his increasingly strange and paranoid behavior. A former supervisor, now retired and reached by phone, told Tanaka that Thorne had become obsessed with the idea of living underground. He had developed a bizarre theory about a coming solar event that would make the surface of the Earth uninhabitable, and he believed that only those who had adapted to life underground in advance would survive. The company's official documents contained a record of his dismissal, dated about 10 years before Maya's disappearance. The wording was vague, but suggestive: violation of work discipline and dangerous, paranoid behavior. After his dismissal, the official trail of Elias Thorne began to disappear. Tanaka had local deputies and Forest Service rangers quietly interview longtime residents and shop owners in the small towns around Shasta. For several years after his dismissal, people occasionally saw a man matching his description: tall, gaunt, with a large, old-fashioned backpack and what looked like a geologist's hammer on his belt in the remote parts of the forest. Some called him a crank, others a hermit, but no one perceived him as a threat. Tanaka then cross-referenced old survey maps from Thorne's former company with the location where Maya was found. According to one of the geologists who had worked with him, Thorne may have known about the existence of extensive, unmapped lava tube systems that were not included in any public records. It was this secret knowledge that would have allowed him to move underground as if it were his own private labyrinth. The police organized a new, covert search operation, but this time it was not aimed at rescue. It was aimed at finding Thorne's possible hiding places. They used ground-penetrating radar, cavity scanners, and the help of cavers specializing in mapping unknown areas. The search lasted for a week. In several remote canyons, they found the remains of temporary campsites, traces of small, smokeless fires, empty food cans, and pieces of old canvas that had served as shelter from the rain. The most important discovery was made early the next week. In a remote, almost inaccessible part of the forest, the team found a hidden, semi-permanent camp. It consisted of a small, dugout shelter, an old tarp, and a makeshift dwelling made of stones and logs. According to the investigators, the place looked like it had been left in a hurry. Some things were scattered, and the ground under the tarp was pressed with fresh footprints. There were several items inside that immediately caught their attention. Small metal boxes filled with dried roots and fungi, pieces of cloth with traces of volcanic soil, an old lantern with a yellowed glass globe, and several notebooks bound with waxed twine. It was these notebooks that became the key to understanding who Elias Thorne had become in his years of isolation. Experts called them his observation diaries. The pages contained short, handwritten notes. The handwriting was sharp and precise, but the content was deeply disturbing. The texts described the movements of hikers on the trails around Mount Shasta, with notes on their gear, their routes, and the hours when the trails were least crowded. Some entries were dated not with numbers, but with phrases like, "after the first snow," or "the Perseids." There was a second part of the diaries, the most troubling part. There, Thorne described his own twisted philosophy of a new humanity that would need to adapt to life without the sun. He called himself a shepherd of the coming age, and the people he saw on the trails he referred to as potentials or candidates. In several places, he mentioned a student who was withstanding the darkness better than expected. The context and the location of the discovery left no doubt that he was referring to Maya. None of the diaries specifically described how he held her captive, but some phrases were so chillingly similar to Maya's fragmented experience that investigators immediately made the connection. One entry contained the phrase, "She still fears the dark, but the dark will be her teacher." Another read, "The exit is closed. The lesson must not be disturbed." The police tried to find Thorne's trail leading from the abandoned camp. They combed every ravine and technical passage in the canyon that led deeper into the rocks. Search teams with K9 South followed a scent trail for several miles, but it broke off at the edge of a sheer cliff where there were only old boot marks and a single displaced stone. The cavers on the team speculated that he might have gone down one of the deep, unexplored vertical lava tubes, the kind that lead to vast, uncharted systems. For an ordinary person, this would have been a death sentence. But for Thorne, who had lived in such conditions for years, it could have been an escape route. Officially, the police said that Elias Thorne was a fugitive and his whereabouts were unknown. But in unofficial comments, detectives said otherwise. He disappeared into the same subterranean world where he had spent most of his life. He was never seen again. There were rumors among the locals, of course. Sometimes at night, someone would claim to hear strange tapping sounds coming from deep within the earth, or see a faint yellow light moving between the trees in a place no one should be. But these stories were never confirmed. In Detective Tanaka's final report, dated late that fall, there was an entry that most accurately described the end of the operation. "We found his world, but we did not find him. He remains a shadow, a ghost that this mountain has produced, and which it seems to have taken back into itself, in the same way that Maya Jimenez once disappeared. Official medical reports drawn up during the first months after Maya Jimenez's return described her condition as a slow, painful reintegration into reality. The doctors recalled that her reactions remained delayed for a long time, and her body was so weakened that even a short walk across the hospital room required several minutes of rest. She began to gain weight only after many weeks, and the process was unstable. Her digestive system, accustomed to a diet of roots and rodents, sometimes violently rejected normal food, as if her body itself refused to return to a normal rhythm of life. The psychologists who observed her wrote in their notes that Maya often subconsciously scanned the corners of any room she was in, her eyes darting into the shadows as if checking to see if someone was hiding there. In the first months, she could not stand darkened corridors and asked to have the door to her room left open, even at night. A nurse who worked in the rehabilitation unit recalled that Maya would sometimes wake up with a silent scream, her body rigid with fear, but she could not explain what she had dreamed. She would only repeat the word him. Subsequently, on the recommendation of psychotherapists, Maya was transferred to a long-term recovery program which included work with specialists in trauma caused by prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. The report of one of them reads, "The patient demonstrates reactions characteristic of people who have been held in an environment devoid of normal sensory stimuli for an extended period. The space without light has left a deep and lasting mark on her cognitive and emotional functioning. In addition to nighttime panic attacks, she suffered from a severe and debilitating form of claustrophobia. Any confined space, even a standard MRI machine, caused a sharp and uncontrollable loss of control. The doctors had to cancel crucial examinations several times because Maya refused to enter the equipment, mentioning the pressure of the stone. Despite these immense challenges, her recovery process was moving forward. Her family supported her every day, even though they recognized that the Maya who came back from the mountain was different. Her speech remained quiet and restrained. Her spatial perception was altered, and her attention was often scattered. According to her mother, she could sometimes sit by a window for hours, as if rediscovering the way light fell on the floor, watching its shape change as the sun moved across the sky. Meanwhile, the case of Elias Thorne has been classified as a long-term search. The Siskiyou County Sheriff was careful to emphasize in his comments, "We have no reason to believe he is dead. We have no reason to believe he has left the state." Local newspapers published occasional articles about the cave hermit of Mount Shasta, who was never caught. However, no credible witnesses have reported any new encounters. Search operations in the more remote areas of the mountain were carried out several more times, all without success. Spelunkers who participated in these operations said that the underground world of Mount Shasta was vast, dangerous, and virtually unmapped. There were countless lava tubes and fissures that even experienced specialists did not risk entering. After Maya's story became public, the U.S. Forest Service conducted a large-scale revision of its search and rescue protocols for the Shasta Trinity National Forest. The list of changes includes mandatory checks of known cave and lava tube systems within a several-mile radius of a missing person's point of origin, increased control over access to unstable areas, and new rules for working in remote canyons. The official statement reads, "The Jimenez case has shown that remote subterranean cavities can serve as a hiding place for individuals who operate outside the control of society and think in unpredictable ways." Mount Shasta, which had a controversial reputation before, has gained a new, darker layer to its legend. Tourists who used to hike long routes on their own were now more likely to join group hikes. Some locals said that Maya's story gave the mountain back its voice. It reminded them that this place does not forgive mistakes, and that some of its secrets are all too real. As for Maya herself, she returned to life slowly and cautiously. Her doctors noted positive dynamics, but emphasized that the psychological consequences of her ordeal could remain with her forever. She was learning to live with them in the same way she had learned to live with the darkness underground, without fanfare, without words, just accepting the fact that her world had irrevocably changed. Her family tried not to talk about the mountain in her presence. According to her father, Maya once said that she can still feel the shadow of the stone when she even hears the name Shasta. It was a metaphor that neither doctors nor psychologists could fully explain. The official case of Maya Jimenez's abduction remains formally open to this day. It contains dozens of photographs, copies of Thorne's diaries, forensic analyses from the lava tube, maps, and interrogation reports. But the main document in the case is still missing: the final report. It was never written because the sheriff's office cannot close something that has no ending. For Maya herself, the answer was different. She survived. But according to her doctor, a part of her remained where she had lived for 2 years among the stone. That place still reminds us of her with its dry, cold air, its darkness without movement, and a silence that seems deeper than a whisper. And although Elias Thorne was never found, the shadow he cast from within the mountain continues to live on apart from him. In the very place where Maya lost years of her life, this shadow remains almost as real as the stone that once blocked her path to the sun. Our hearts go out to the Jimenez family, and we hope one day the full truth is revealed. Be good to yourselves and each other. I'll see you a little farther down the trail.